In Greek mythology, some bloodlines are born for glory, while others are born only to pay for it. The House of Atreus belonged to the latter, long before its name echoed through the tragedies of Aeschylus and Seneca. It had already been carved into the Greek imagination as a stain that could never be washed clean, a hereditary curse where each generation was born only to atone for the sins of the last. And at the root of this darkness stood one man, Tantalus, king of Lydia, once beloved of the gods, but doomed by his own arrogance. They said Tantalus was a son of Zeus. God or mortal, he was granted rare favor to dine among the Olympians, to drink their nectar, to taste ambrosia, the food of immortality. He was no longer merely human, but a bridge between the divine and the mortal. Yet the higher the gift, the deeper the pride. And from that pride was born an act so blasphemous it poisoned an entire lineage, the crime that gave birth to the idea of miasma, sacred pollution. Tantalus wished to test the gods, to see if they truly were all-knowing. So he devised a banquet, not of celebration, but of desecration. Amid the glittering goblets and golden wine, he slaughtered his own son. Pelops cut the boy into pieces and served him to the gods as a meal. He waited, watching, to see if they would notice. One by one, the gods understood. They recoiled in horror. Only Demeter, dazed by grief for her lost daughter Persephone, absent-mindedly ate a small piece, the boy's left shoulder. When the truth emerged, the feast fell silent. The crime was unspeakable, a father turning his child into a test of divine wisdom, shattering not only morality but the sacred bond between parent and child. The gods were not merely enraged, they were disgusted. They gathered what remained of Pelops, stitched him together, and restored his life. To replace the missing shoulder that Demeter had eaten, they fitted him with one of ivory, pale and gleaming, a mark he would carry forever, a scar carved into legend. Pelops lived again, but the family's blood was forever tainted. As for Tantalus, he was hurled into Tartarus, the deepest pit of the underworld, where no light reached. His punishment was a grotesque mirror of his crime. He stood in a pool of clear water beneath branches heavy with fruit. Yet each time he bent to drink, the water receded. Each time he reached for the fruit, the branches withdrew. Forever starving, forever thirsty, forever tormented by what he could almost touch but never possess. From him the Greeks coined a word, tantalize, to mean a torment of desire without fulfillment. But the god's wrath did not end with him. His sign had poisoned his bloodline. From this point onward, the curse clung to his descendants, an invisible infection of the soul. This was miasma, not a spell or divine curse, but a moral contagion. Every act, no matter how noble, would twist into ruin. It was said that from Tantalus onward, the family was doomed to repeat his defiance. Fathers against sons, wives against husbands, children against parents. The House of Atreus was born not from honor, but from sacrilege, a feast of blood disguised as devotion. The Greeks saw this not merely as myth, but as cosmic warning. The banquet, that symbol of unity, hospitality, and kinship, was inverted into an abomination. In that inversion lay the essence of their tragedy. When divine order, cosmos, is violated, chaos, eros, seeps through. The gods turned away, and men were left to devour each other. From Tantalus to his son Pelops, the curse did not fade, it changed shape. Pelops grew into beauty, tall and radiant, a favorite of Poseidon himself. Some said the sea god gave him a chariot drawn by immortal horses, symbols of power and destiny. But the gifts of gods to cursed men are always double-edged. In every blessing lies a demand for repayment. Tantalus had tested the gods. Pelops would test mankind. The father's blasphemy became the son's betrayal. Where Tantalus had offended heaven, Pelops would offend the earth. And though their crimes differed, the essence remained the same. Hubris, the arrogance that drives mortals to act as gods. From this moment on, the fate of the House of Atreus was sealed. Each victory would be bought with deceit. Each celebration would plant the seed of its own undoing. The cycle had begun, a spiral of sin and punishment, of blood begetting blood. The Greeks called it ancestral guilt, not a punishment from outside, but a disease within. A moral inheritance passed from father to son like a birthright. That is why the story of Tantalus mattered. It was not about the wrath of gods, but about the corruption of spirit that no divine mercy could cleanse. Pelops carried two legacies when he returned from Olympus: the grace of the divine and the darkness of his father. He was reborn, not as an innocent, but as a vessel of contradiction, beautiful, favored, and already doomed. His ivory shoulder gleamed in the sun, a silent reminder that even perfection can be stitched together from sin. And so, as Pelops grew and loved, as he sought victory and empire, the shadow of Tantalus walked beside him. The curse no longer thundered from the heavens. It whispered from within, urging deceit, ambition, betrayal. The gods no longer needed to strike. Men would destroy themselves. Down in Tartarus, Tantalus still bends toward the water he can never drink. Above him, his descendants stretch their hands toward redemption, and like him, grasp only emptiness. For the House of Atreus, every reach toward glory would end the same way, in hunger, in thirst, and in blood that calls for more blood. Pelops was the second chance of a cursed house, a young man resurrected from his father's madness, blessed by the gods, and touched by a beauty that almost seemed divine. The ivory shoulder glowed like moonlight, a symbol of grace reborn from desecration. Yet beneath that radiance, the curse of Tantalus still coiled, silent but alive. The Greeks believed that sin could cling like a shadow, moving from father to son, not through punishment, but through imitation, a pattern repeating itself in the soul. And soon Pelops would prove that even a man restored by the gods could not outrun the inheritance of his blood. When Pelops came of age, he sought a wife worthy of his ambition. He set his eyes on Hippodamia, the daughter of King Inamos of Pisa, a woman said to be as clever as she was beautiful. But Inamos was not a father eager to give his daughter away. An oracle had warned him that he would die by the hand of his son-in-law. Terrified of prophecy, that inescapable force that ruled all Greek tragedy, the king devised a cruel test. Any man who wished to marry Hippodamia must face him in a chariot race. If the suitor won, he would claim her hand. If he lost, he would be executed on the spot. The king's chariot was unstoppable, drawn by horses gifted by Ares, swift as storm winds. Suitor after suitor fell, their bodies broken, their heads impaled on stakes that lined the palace gates. One after another, they came in hope and died in dust. By the time Pelops arrived, 12 skulls crowned the courtyard like trophies of prophecy fulfilled. Yet he did not flinch. Pelops had something those before him did not: divine favor and human cunning. He knew he could not win by speed or strength alone. So he sought help from Myrtilus, the king's trusted charioteer, a man rumored to be the son of Hermes himself, a being of trickery, quickness, and quiet betrayal. Pelops promised him a reward beyond measure: gold, glory, and, in some tellings, the embrace of Hippodamia herself. Myrtilus hesitated, then agreed, for even the loyal can be corrupted by promise. Together they hatched a plan. On the night before the race, Myrtilus secretly replaced the bronze linchpins of the king's chariot, the metal bolts that held the wheels, with ones made of wax. When dawn came, the air was heavy with anticipation. The two chariots stood at the starting line, the horses stamping, the reins trembling. Enemouse gave a final, confident smile. The signal was given. The race began. At first, the king surged ahead, his divine horses devouring the ground beneath them. Pelops followed, the wind tearing through his hair, his heart pounding with the rhythm of destiny. As the sun climbed higher, the wax softened. The wheels began to tremble, and at the moment Enemouse drew near enough to strike, the axles melted, the wheels tore free, and the king's chariots shattered into splinters. His body was dragged across the stones, his own horses becoming the instruments of prophecy. Pelops had won. But victory in this family was never clean. The race ended, not in triumph, but in death. Another father felled by his child's ambition. Another prophecy fulfilled by deceit. Myrtilus approached Pelops to claim his reward. Depending on which poet you read, he either demanded Hippodamia herself, or simply a share of her affection. But in the House of Atreus, betrayal never ends with one victim. Pelops, afraid that his secret would be exposed, or enraged that a servant would dare claim his bride, turned on his accomplice. He seized Myrtilus and hurled him from the cliff into the sea. As Myrtilus fell, the wind carried his dying curse, that Pelops and all his descendants would be destroyed by treachery and blood. And in that scream the curse was renewed, a second seed of damnation planted in the same soil. The Greeks had a word for what followed, miasma. It was more than guilt. It was spiritual pollution. The death of Myrtilus was not merely murder. It was the repetition of Tantalus' sin in a new form. The father had tricked the gods with a false meal. The son had tricked a mortal with a false promise. The act was different, but the spirit was the same. Hubris, arrogance, that mocks the sacred order, had found a new host. The curse of Tantalus did not simply continue, it evolved. No longer divine punishment from above, it had become a psychological inheritance, the inability to act without deceit. Pelops' descendants would carry that flaw like a birthmark of the soul. In time, Pelops and Hippodamia had two sons, Atreus and Thyestes. From the moment they were born, the air around them seemed heavy with tension. They grew up hearing of their father's triumph, the chariot race that defied fate, but never of the betrayal that won it. They inherited not just a kingdom, but the invisible residue of Myrtilus' dying curse. And like all curses, it waited patiently. In Greek myth, a curse never strikes like lightning. It seeps, it becomes habit, temperament, destiny. A word spoken in pride becomes a lie becomes a crime becomes a legacy. That is how the House of Atreus took form, not in one night of horror, but through generations, slowly losing the ability to distinguish victory from sin. Pelops, for all his splendor, died a king admired, envied, praised. The people saw the ivory shoulder and called it divine. They saw the crown and called it justice. But the gods saw what men could not, that every triumph built on deceit becomes a throne of bone. And in the halls of Mycenae, the next generation sharpened its knives. The curse had grown roots deep within the House of Atreus. From Tantalus' blasphemy to Pelops' betrayal, it had passed unseen, not as a storm, but as a pattern. By the time the twin sons of Pelops were grown, that pattern had already become prophecy. Their names were Atreus and Thyestes, princes of Mycenae, born into privilege, raised in splendor, and destined to destroy each other. Atreus was the elder, proud, stern, convinced that the gods themselves had chosen him to rule. Thyestes was his opposite, charming, cunning, driven by desire rather than duty. Together they inherited not a throne, but a battlefield disguised as a family. The Greeks had a saying, "The curse of the father sleeps in the hearts of the sons." And in the House of Atreus, that sleep was never peaceful. When Pelops died, the question of succession tore the brothers apart. Both claimed the right to rule. Both invoked omens, prophecies, and divine favor. But behind their arguments hid something darker, envy. For Atreus possessed something Thyestes wanted, above all, a golden lamb, said to have fallen from the heavens, the symbol of kingship itself. As long as the lamb remained in Atreus' house, the throne was his by divine decree. But Thyestes was not content to watch his brother reign. With the help of a rope, Atreus' wife, who had long been entangled in Thyestes' seductions, he stole the golden lamb and declared himself king. For a time, it seemed the curse had shifted sides. The younger brother had triumphed. The elder was cast down. Yet, as in all Greek stories, the gods play favorites in silence. Zeus sent Hermes to restore Atreus' claim, commanding that the sun itself reverse its path as a sign. When the day turned backward, when light itself fled from the sky, Thyestes' rule ended. Atreus took back his crown, but his victory brought no peace. It brought fury. Betrayed by his brother, humiliated by his wife, Atreus' heart hardened into something monstrous. The blood of Tantalus stirred in him. He did not want justice. He wanted reversal, a vengeance so total that even the gods would shudder. He pretended forgiveness. He sent word to Thyestes, inviting him home. He spoke of reconciliation, of family restored, of bygone years healed by time. Thyestes, weary of exile and desperate for stability, accepted. He returned with his young sons, thinking the storm had passed. Atreus welcomed him with open arms, a smile like a mask, and a feast prepared in his honor. The hall was vast and glowing, filled with wine and music. Servants poured silver goblets of crimson drink. The smell of roasted meat filled the air. Thyestes laughed again for the first time in years, believing his brother's heart had softened. But the gods and the walls knew better. When the feast was over, Atreus gestured to the covered dishes that still lay upon the table. He ordered them uncovered. What lay beneath was not food, but flesh. The flesh of Thyestes' own sons, carved, cooked, and served to their father. The laughter died. The room fell silent. Thyestes stared in disbelief as Atreus revealed the severed heads and hands, laid out like trophies. It was a moment that froze time. No war, no murder, no betrayal in Greek myth was ever darker. The poets would later call it the banquet of horror. Thyestes screamed, not in anger, but in agony so pure that even the gods turned their faces away. His cry echoed through the palace like thunder. The feast that began with wine and warmth ended with horror and madness. Atreus stood calm, proud of what he had done. To him, the meal was not merely revenge, it was justice, a perfect symmetry of crime and punishment. Thyestes had stolen his wife, his throne, his pride. Now he had eaten his own bloodline. Balance, Atreus thought, had been restored. But the Greeks knew better. In their eyes, vengeance never restores, it multiplies. Each act of retribution feeds the next, and the gods, weary of human arrogance, let the wheel spin until it devours itself. The House of Atreus had reached its first true nadir. Tantalus had mocked the gods by serving divine guests the flesh of a child. Atreus had mocked the divine order by feeding a father the flesh of his children. The sin had come full circle. The cycle of the curse was now perfect, and therefore unbreakable. Thyestes fled into the night, broken but not dead. He wandered the land, haunted by the image of his sons' faces. His grief became rage, his rage became hunger, and that hunger whispered to him of a prophecy, one that could return his pain to its source. He went to the oracle, desperate to know how he could destroy Atreus. The answer was a horror even darker than the feast itself. "You will have a son," the oracle said, "and that son will be born of your daughter. Only he, born of your own blood and sin, will avenge you." Thyestes recoiled. Even he, a man who had eaten his children, trembled before the thought. But grief is a patient poison. In time it hardens into obedience. He obeyed the oracle. By his own daughter, Pelopeia, Thyestes conceived a child, born of incest and prophecy. The boy was hidden away, unwanted even by his mother, left to die or be forgotten. But fate, in the cruel symmetry of Greek myth, had other plans. Aegisthus would grow up in the very palace of the man he was destined to kill, adopted and raised by Atreus himself. In that irony, the gods smiled their coldest smile. The man who had destroyed his brother S' children would raise his brother S' avenger as his own. This is how curses work in the ancient world, not by fire or thunder, but by the slow twisting of fate, until love itself becomes a weapon. The feast of horror had ended, but the hunger remained. Somewhere in the halls of Mycenae, a child slept beneath the shadow of prophecy. The gods were silent. The curse was not. From the ashes of Atreus's vengeance rose his sons Agamemnon and Menelaus, heirs to a throne built upon betrayal. They were born into gold and glory, but every jewel they wore glittered with the reflection of blood. To outsiders, they were kings favored by the gods, commanders of men and bearers of divine right. But to the Greeks who remembered the stories whispered through generations, they were simply the next chapter of the curse, the living continuation of miasma. When Atreus was finally murdered by Aegisthus, the son, born of his brother's incest, the kingdom fractured, yet the two princes survived. Agamemnon, the elder, became ruler of Mycenae, while Menelaus took Sparta and married Helen, the woman whose beauty poets claimed could move the tides. For a brief and shining moment, it seemed the curse had loosened its grip. Two brothers, two kingdoms, peace between them, a fragile balance in a world that had forgotten what peace felt like. But curses in Greek stories never end. They simply wait. The first crack came from a single act of arrogance, a gesture so small it could have been ignored. But the gods never ignore the proud. The fleets of Greece gathered at Aulis, preparing to sail against Troy. The wind should have carried them, but the air was still, the sea glass-flat. Weeks passed, supplies rotted, morale broke. The soldiers began to whisper that Artemis, goddess of the hunt, had been offended. Some said Agamemnon had boasted that his skill with a bow surpassed hers. Others whispered that he had killed one of her sacred deer. Whatever the cause, the seer Calchas declared the truth. The goddess demanded a price, not gold, not prayer, but blood. The only offering that would raise the wind was the sacrifice of Agamemnon's daughter, Iphigenia. Imagine the silence that followed. The men stared at their king, the man who commanded 1,000 ships, the chosen of Zeus. To save his army, he would have to murder his child. Agamemnon hesitated. For a heartbeat, he was only a father. Then the curse whispered to him, as it had whispered to every man of his line. To protect your throne, sacrifice your blood." He agreed, but he could not summon Iphigenia to her death without deceit. He sent word to his wife, Clytemnestra, telling her that their daughter had been chosen to marry the hero Achilles. The queen, elated, brought Iphigenia to Aulis, dressed in white, her face radiant with innocence. Only when she reached the altar did she see the knife. The poets argue about what happened next. Some say Artemis took pity and replaced the girl with a deer at the last moment, whisking Iphigenia away in a cloud of divine smoke. Others insist she died on the stones, her blood darkening the windless earth. Either way, the result was the same. The air shifted, the sails filled, the army rejoiced, and Clytemnestra's heart broke. She returned to Mycenae, hollowed by grief, hatred slowly ripening within her. For 10 long years, while Agamemnon led his armies at Troy, she nursed that hatred, shaping it into resolve. And beside her grew Aegisthus, the son of incest, the man raised by her husband's father, the instrument of divine retribution waiting patiently in her bed. When the Trojan War ended, Agamemnon returned home crowned in victory. He had conquered Troy, commanded nations, and returned with spoils of war, including Cassandra, daughter of Priam, a princess cursed by Apollo to speak the truth and never be believed. The sun dipped low as his ships reached the Mycenaean shore. He imagined feasts, songs, and garlands, but the halls that awaited him were quiet, watchful. Clytemnestra stood at the gates, radiant in red robes, her face calm, her words honeyed. She spoke of welcome, of reunion, of forgiveness, and Agamemnon, weary from war, believed her. He did not see the trap closing. Some versions say she invited him to walk upon a purple tapestry, a gesture reserved only for the gods. It was a subtle act of hubris, a mortal accepting honors meant for Olympus. He walked proudly across it, sealing his fate. Others tell that she waited until he bathed, relaxing in the water, his sword laid aside. Then, as the steam rose around him, she drew the blade. The strike came sudden and merciless. Some say she wrapped him in a heavy cloth before stabbing, so he could not defend himself. Others claim she struck with an axe, each blow an echo of the sacrifice he had once made at Aulis. Cassandra screamed warnings. She had foreseen it all, but no one listened. She too was dragged inside, butchered beside him, her prophecies dying with her breath. Clytemnestra stood over her husband's body, blood still dripping from her hands. Justice, she called it. Justice for Iphigenia. Justice for betrayal. Justice for the lies of gods and men. But in the House of Atreus, justice is never pure. Agamemnon's death was not the end of the curse. It was its continuation, vengeance feeding vengeance, husband against wife, mother against child, a perfect mirror of every crime that came before. Outside, the people of Mycenae whispered that the queen had brought balance, that the curse was over. Inside, the walls of the palace knew better. They had heard this before, from Tantalus, from Atreus, from every soul who mistook vengeance for peace. For in a family like this, peace was only the pause between murders. And so Clytemnestra reigned beside Aegisthus, the blood of her husband still drying in the cracks of the stone. But somewhere in that same palace, 2 young hearts beat in silence, Electra and Orestes, children of the slain king. They watched, they waited, and in their grief the curse found new voices. For soon the wind that had carried the Greeks to Troy would return, not from the sea this time, but from within the house itself, and it would blow red. The palace of Mycenae had fallen into silence. In the great hall where kings once feasted, the echo of slaughter still lingered. Agamemnon was gone, and in his place sat Clytemnestra and Aegisthus, the queen and her lover, their hands red but unrepentant. For 10 years they ruled together, not as monarchs of peace, but as caretakers of rot. Beneath the gold and incense, the walls whispered. The ghosts of the past had not been buried, they were listening. And among the living, 2 figures remained who could still hear them, Electra and Orestes, the children of the slain king. Electra, once a princess, had become a shadow. She wandered the corridors barefoot, her hair unkempt, her eyes hollow from weeping. The poets called her the mourner of Mycenae. She was forced to serve her mother, the woman who had murdered her father, and each day she endured her humiliation in silence. Yet under that silence burned a slow, relentless fire, the memory of a blade raised over the bath, the sound of Cassandra's last cry. Her brother, Orestes, had been spirited away as a child, hidden from Aegisthus's reach. He grew up in exile, haunted by the story of his father's death. And one night, the god Apollo appeared to him in a dream, commanding him to return. "Avenge your father," the god whispered, "or live forever cursed." Orestes obeyed. He came to Mycenae in secret, cloaked in rags, his heart torn between dread and duty. The reunion with Electra was a moment the Greeks never forgot. She had prayed for his return through every lonely dawn, and when she saw him again, her grief broke into trembling joy. They clung to each other like 2 survivors washed ashore from a shipwreck. But even in that moment, destiny pressed close for love, and this family was never free of blood. Together, they plotted vengeance. Orestes would enter the palace disguised as a traveler, bringing news that Orestes, son of Agamemnon, was dead. It was a cruel trick, but deceit had always been the language of their house. When the false message reached Clytemnestra, she exhaled with relief. The last threat to her throne was gone, or so she believed. She welcomed the stranger with smiles and honeyed words, and as she offered him food and rest, Orestes dropped his disguise. The blade that had slept for a decade found its mark. Aegisthus was killed first, swiftly, brutally. Then came the mother. Here the story darkens beyond judgment. Clytemnestra raised her hands, showing the breasts that had once nursed him. "Do you not fear the curse, my son?" she said. "Do you not remember whose blood flows in your veins?" For a heartbeat, Orestes faltered. The sword wavered. In her voice, he heard not a murderer, but a mother. Yet behind him, Electra whispered, "Remember, father. Remember, The House of Atreus had always demanded a price, and hesitation was never mercy, only delay. Orestes struck. Clytemnestra fell, her final cry echoing through the same halls where Agamemnon had died. The circle was complete. The Greeks believed there was no sin darker than matricide, not even cannibalism, not even sacrilege. To kill the one who gave you life was to wound the earth itself. And so the moment the queen's blood touched the floor, the air changed. It grew thick, electric. The smell of iron and incense merged into something primal. Orestes staggered back. The world blurred, and then he heard them, the Furies. They came from the darkness, ancient goddesses older than Olympus, born from the blood of Uranus when he was overthrown. Hair of snakes, eyes like embers, hands dripping with venom. They were the Erinyes, avengers of kinslaying. Only Orestes could see them, but their presence twisted the air. Their whispering filled his ears, repeating the word that would haunt him. Mother killer, mother killer. He fled into the night, stumbling across plains and forests, pursued by unseen footsteps. Every shadow became a claw. Every breath became a curse. The son of Agamemnon had freed his father's ghost and enslaved his own. The chase went on for days, weeks, years. No mortal could tell. The Furies do not tire. They do not forgive. They hound the soul until madness cracks it open. At last, Orestes reached Delphi, the sanctuary of Apollo, begging the god who had commanded him to save him. Apollo received him with pity. "You have done what was right," he said. "But even right can be defiled when it spills a mother's blood." The god could not silence the Furies, for they were older than he, older than light itself. So Apollo sent him onward to Athens to seek the judgment of Athena, goddess of wisdom and war. And thus, for the first time in myth, vengeance was brought before law. On the rocky hill of the Areopagus, the first court in history convened. 12 mortals sat as jurors, and above them stood the gods themselves. The Furies, coiled in fury, demanded death. Apollo stood beside Orestes, arguing that he had acted not out of hatred, but of divine command. The trial lasted through the night. When dawn came, the votes were counted, equal, half for acquittal, half for condemnation. And then Athena stepped forward. She cast her own vote for mercy. "There is no justice in endless blood," she said. "Let wisdom replace vengeance, and reason stand where rage once ruled." The balance tipped. Orestes was freed. The curse, at last, was broken. But even as the Furies howled in outrage, Athena soothed them. "You shall not be forgotten," she promised. "You shall become the Eumenides, the kindly ones, guardians of justice instead of its destroyers." And so, vengeance was transformed into law. The sword gave way to the courtroom, and the cries of the damned became the hymns of a city. Orestes returned to Mycenae, not as a hero, but as a hollow man. His family was gone, his throne empty, his soul exhausted. But in his weary silence, Greece had learned something new, that justice, once born from blood, could evolve into something purer. The curse of the House of Atreus had devoured generations, consuming fathers, sons, mothers, and daughters alike. Yet in its end, it gave birth to an idea that would shape the Greek world forever, that the cycle of vengeance could be ended not by death, but by law. Still, the echo remains. In every act of arrogance, in every hunger for retribution, the spirit of Tantalus stirs. For the Greeks knew, and we know still, that within every victory lies the seed of its undoing, and within every heart the whisper that began it all. Blood always calls for more blood.